Okay, well, good morning, everyone. We'll go ahead and sort of get settled in here. And we'll have a few people coming in late. Naturally, that's how it works. Fridays driving across Lincoln. So I want to thank you all for coming in. Some new faces today. My name is Tyler Williams. I'm the extension educator located here in Lancaster County, but I also serve Lancaster, Casanova County, so sort of the surrounding area. Today, the topic is on soils, soil fertility. You probably know that. It's why you're here. The camera is, we are live streaming on YouTube, so we've got a couple people that couldn't make it, and so they can watch it from wherever they're at, I guess. So anyway, so if you're curious to why that's there. Yeah, a couple things. Today, if you don't know where the restrooms are, they're down around the hall. Also, you found the snacks and coffee and things like that in the back. First, want to thank the folks from Ag Source back there. There's Kevin, right, and Jacob. They're sponsors today. They'll be talking during the break a little bit as well, and right during the discussion part. So thank them for helping out today. Also, one of our speakers today is Aaron Nygren. He'll be the first one up, and then we'll have Rick Kelch, who I believe stepped out somewhere. So we'll have those two speakers today. Also have a couple folks from NRCS here. So they'll be able to answer questions possibly during the discussion as well. So feel free anytime during the talks to ask questions anytime. As you know, if you've been here, it's a pretty informal group. I like to have some discussion and things like that, and at least get all of your questions answered before you leave. A couple other things. If you are a crop advisor and want to get some CEUs, you can get 2 CEUs today. I've got a sign-in sheet back there. There's also 2 notebooks beside there as well. I put out an ag climate newsletter. You can sign up for that there. And I also am trying some new text messaging service. If you want to be the pilot tester for some of that as well, you can sign up there. With that, I don't think I have anything else to add. We'll go ahead and get started with Aaron. Again, Aaron Nygren, he's a cropping systems extension educator. He's located up in Colfax County. He lives actually not too far up the road here, but he works up north a little bit further. So I drug him down south today to keep him out of the cold. So anyway, so I'll go ahead and turn it over to Aaron, and thank you again all for being here.
Okay, thank you, Tyler. What do we need to get this switched over?
I'll do that.
Okay, first off, oh, that's a little loud. Has everybody got one of these clickers? Okay. If you don't, you'll need one eventually. But like Tyler mentioned, I work up at Schuyler. I actually live by Swedberg, though, just south of Wahoo. Help my brother farm. We got about 80 acres we play with, basically, more or less, between Ashland and Ceresco. So just enough to have a tax write-off some years, right? So, yeah. So I'm going to talk about soil fertility today. One thing, though, first, most important thing related to fertility is just protect your soil. We need to do a better job of some cases. You drive through Saunders County, Lancaster County, some other ones, we're starting to get some of that rill erosion, some of that gully erosion going, which NRCS is more and more concerned about. We're losing our topsoil there, and that's our biggest resource. So just a couple quotes related to that. Franklin Roosevelt, the nation that destroys itself, destroys its soil, destroys itself. And the other one I like, which I've seen as a bumper sticker, despite all our achievements, we owe our existence to a 6-inch layer of topsoil and the fact that it rains. Problem is we need to have an asterisk for that one, right, for Nebraska, and the fact that we have irrigation, right? So a couple things just to make you aware of, just to learn more about your soil. So one thing hopefully everybody's aware of is Web Soil Survey. So if you have one of the old soil books at home, that's fine. But the Web Soil Survey will give you those soil maps as well. So, we need to know more about our soils. So this is a nice website you can go to. You can find your fields there. You can determine what soil series you have in your field. What are the properties of that field, okay? Yes. Yes. Okay, so Web Soil Survey, if you just Google NRCS Web Soil Survey, you'll find that pretty easily, okay? So take advantage of that resource. Another one that's useful is if you're out in the field, if you don't know what soil series you're standing on right there, if you put this on your cell phone, so if you search for soil web app, when you're out in the field, it actually uses the GPS on your phone. It'll tell you what soil series you're standing on right there. So that's kind of helpful just to give yourself a better idea. You know, most of us know our fields fairly well. You kind of know what the bad areas, the good areas are, but this might help that relate you back to what soil type that is. So take advantage of that as well. It's both Apple and Android. It's a free app, so you might as well have it on there, okay? So, first question with a clicker here. And I think I need to reset something here. Hold on a second. It shouldn't be saying that. Technology. Okay. I just need to reset this one. Yep. Oh, now you're going to be trouble. Now I really did break it.
Aaron, one thing.
Yes.
For a web app, I just tried to download that thing and they no longer support the app. And so they said, I called the guy, he just said, go straight to the website.
Okay.
And then you can pull the website up on your smartphone, then it works just the same as the app now.
Thank you for
The website, mobile friendly.
that. Is always a challenge with apps as Apple or other ones redo things, it seems to.
So they're just gonna stop keeping it up.
Yeah. That's too bad. I always liked that one. I apologize for the technical difficulties.
Same thing as the app. You just search the app, and it'll go to the website.
We're getting there.
You know how to run that.
Okay. Okay, try this again. So, big part of soil fertility is soil sampling. So, how often do you soil sample, or how do you soil sample? A, I do my own soil sampling every year. So if that's right, hit A on your clicker. B, I do my own soil sampling every other year. C, I do my own soil sampling every third year or more. Or D, E, and F are the same thing, just that you do it, you have somebody hired, does it for you, okay? Notice I didn't give you, I had a version with another one, which was I don't soil sample. But that's one of those we don't want to hear about, right? We hope that you're soil sampling. I got 20 responses, so we got to be getting pretty close here. Okay, let's see what you said. Okay, so tied for most popular are every third year or more. Tie between you do it yourself or you hire somebody to do it. And then the next one is you hire somebody to do it every year. Whatever you want to do, you know, whatever you choose here, the key is just try to be consistent. You know, if you do your own sampling, try to have a protocol that you use. If you hire somebody to do it, it's best to hire this, you know, try to use that same one again, because I might take a sample that goes down to 7 inches consistently, which I should be getting to 8, right? Now, if I do that consistently over time, it's probably okay. But if I do 7 inches one year, 9 inches the next, 6 inches the next year, I'm getting a different volume of soil there. I'm getting a different type. So that's going to affect my samples, okay? So try to be consistent in what you do. So we do have a NEB guide on soil sampling. So G1740, if you search for guidelines for soil sampling, you'll find that. One of the big things with soil sampling is how do I do it? What is my method? So there's 3 common methods we can do. So how many in here are doing grid sampling? Raise your hand. Getting to be more and more popular with grid sampling. So with grid sampling, we're doing a spot, we drive out there with GPS, we take a sample, we move to the next one, we take a sample. We can do these on different grids with sizes. We can do 2.5, you can do 5, you can do 1 if you really want to spend a lot of money. Just depends on how much money you're willing to invest in that. So with this one, it's more intensive sampling, so we should learn more about the field. Just you hope to get enough out of that data to then do variable rate or something to make that money back, okay? Another one we can do is management zones. So management zones could be set up on different things. They could be off of your yield maps. They could be off of an EC map. Maybe we did a Varus rig through the machine or through the field. You could just do soil types as well. You can do topography. Whatever works for you, you can do a management zone that way. And then the last one is the composite sample. So with that, we typically start in a field. You just do kind of a zigzag pattern, a random pattern through the field. You throw it all together. Now with this, ideally you're not doing more than 20 acres. That would be ideal. 40 is our max, but 20 is better. You want to get a small enough field size that still we get some differences out there. The key with all of these, how many of you have a field that had an old hog lot or a beef feedlot in it? Helps to know some of that long-term history, because even if you haven't fed pigs there for 50 years, I guarantee you it's still going to be higher in nutrients. So, if you take 4 samples from there and a couple from the rest of the field, it's going to inflate the rest of your field. So, helps to know some of that field history. So here's an example soil. If you go to your book, if you flip to the last pages of the soil fertility, there's a couple blue pages. So on your handout, there should be some blue soil tests. Wouldn't hurt actually just to pull those out, because we'll look at those kind of throughout here. It's going to show up better on your blue one than on the screen here. So how many of you looked at a soil sample before? Was it confusing the first time? There's a lot of data on there, right? There's ppm, there's different acronyms that we don't know. If you step through it though, we can find the most important things and then go off of that, okay? So they're not dumb. They kind of give you the stuff that's most important first, usually on these anyway. So on this one, the very first thing they report to you is soil pH, which I would say is probably the first thing you should look at on a field, okay? Because if our pH is messed up, that's going to make a big difference in the availability of all the other nutrients. So try to get your pH right first. Then, organic matter is important to look at, nitrates, and then phosphorus. So those are probably 4 biggest determining factors for yield a lot of times, so that's why they're often reported first. So here's another clicker question for you. My lowest soil pH is, so now you got to try to remember if you had a soil test done recently. A, 7 to 6.6, B, 6.5 to 6.1, C, 6 to 5.6, D, 5.5 to 5.1, E, 5.0 to 4.6, or F, I don't know, but I hope it isn't lower than 4.6. So go ahead and use your clicker. Okay. So we got 21% of you that don't know. We hope it isn't lower than that, because if it's that low, you're definitely having some yield issues, okay? But majority of you, though, 6 to 5.6. A few of you higher, a few of you lower. We're starting to see more and more of those low samples come back, though. Just anytime we're using a nitrogen fertilizer in our system, we are going to reduce soil pH. So eventually, over time, we're going to have to take a corrective action. So the key is be proactive, get that sampled, and try to take advantage of, or correct that, okay? So when we have a low pH, we use lime. The critical values that we need, so in a corn-soybean rotation, which is what most of us are in, we would ideally say you need to start applying lime if you get down to a 5.6 or a 5.8, somewhere in there. And then what we're going to do, what the university recommends, is adding lime to bring that back up to a 6.5. If we're in continuous corn, we have a value lower, of 5 to 5.2. Why do you think that is? Which one of those crops is more critical of pH, beans or corn? Soybeans, right? So a lot of this depends on what is the most sensitive crop in your rotation. If we grow alfalfa, then we have to have a pH of 6 would be our recommendation. So just know what's in your cropping rotation. A lot of times that might, get us in trouble if we go to alfalfa if we don't bring that pH back up. Whenever we look at a soil test, you'll see there's a soil pH and then there's also a buffer pH. Is that confusing for anybody? Knowing the difference there. So the soil pH is the actual acidity there. The buffer pH is a measure of how much lime we have to add, to bring that back up. So it's reserve acidity there. So one of our NEB guys has this analogy. So if we have 2 coffee pots, we have a 60 cup and a 20 cup. You've got the tube here, which is the active acidity, which is what's in that soil solution, which is what is reported as the pH there. The reserve acidity is that buffer, which is what's left in the rest of the pot, okay? So when I take a cup of coffee out, both of these are going to drop down to the same amount, right? But then, if you look at how much that changed that reserve, the big 60 pot there's a lot left there, so it doesn't change much. The smaller one takes a lot more out. So these are our lower buffer capacity, our sandy soils, our low CEC soils. Clay soils just have a lot higher buffer capacity, so that's why it takes a lot more to bring them up. So once we get to that buffer pH, if that's based on that is how we determine how much lime we have to apply. So our UNL recommended rate is 1,000 to 1,200 pounds of ag lime for every 0.1% buffer pH below 7. One assumption with that is that it's 60% effective lime. So if you go through our NEB guide, it's going to give you need to look at the effectiveness of that lime. And any supplier that you ask, they should give you a sample of that lime. So you may need to adjust that up or down, depending on how good that lime is. That effectiveness depends on the grind, how finely ground it is, the source of it. So an example of that buffer pH, here we have 3 different soils. We have a loamy sand, a silt loam, and a silty clay loam, all with a soil pH around 5.5, 5.6. Without looking at buffer pH, you would think it would take a similar amount of lime to bring those all up to 6.5. But that buffer pH, the loamy sand had a buffer of 6.8, the silt loam 6.6, the silty clay loam 6.2. So the lime rate goes from 1 to 2 to 4 tons. So that's our challenge on some of these silty clay loams. If you get down into that 4, you get it down to a low 5, you look at how much lime they're recommending and it gives you sticker shock. The other problem with that is typically we don't want to put on more than about 3 tons of lime in one shot. And even in no-till, that's pushing it. No-till, you might want to go 1 ton to 1.5 tons and then come back in a couple years and add some more. So if we can stay ahead of it, we're much better off in the long run than getting behind and then having to add a whole bunch. There's probably some landowners in the room and there's probably some farmers in the room. So one of the questions here is who pays for lime, right? Is it the landowner? Is it the tenant? In reality, the landowner should probably kick in, but is that what is happening currently? No, in a lot of cases, right? But this is a study, this was a long-term study of a field done up in Washington County. So this field, they applied lime back in 1995. That cost them about $50. And then they tracked the yield of the lime field versus the non-lime strips in a corn soybean rotation. They tracked that all the way to 2010, so 15 years worth of data here. They have a gross return and a net return. So the net return after 15 years was $400 per acre from that initial lime application. Is that a pretty good return on your money? Not too bad for a $50 investment, right? Lime is this first thing we should correct on any field. You know, if pH is off, get that lime applied. So in reality, you know, we should be talking to landlords saying, you know, this is something for your soil. We should probably be splitting part of that. One of the challenges of that, right? If I pay for the lime, it's going to pay back for 5 or 10 years. With leased land, we always worry, what if they kick me off in 2 years, right? I just paid for them for something that they're going to get the benefit of. Ideally, in any lease, we should have something in there that says, if you kick me off after X number of years, this is how much I should get back. You know, there should be something in there to help you cover that cost. Alvin Ock's going to be here next week. He could give you more insight into that next week too. Okay, moving on. The next important thing to look at is organic matter. So organic matter, key with organic matter, the more organic matter we have, it's a great way. It stores nutrients and it stores water. You know, those are two things we definitely want during the growing season. Everybody, you can usually see those eroded hillsides. You know, they've lost a lot of organic matter. They've also lost nutrients. In a drought, those are the first that are going to burn up. Versus those areas that have high organic matter, they hang on. If you can hang on for another week, that might get you to where that next rain comes, right? So that organic matter is definitely important. Organic matter is something you could track. You don't see much change year to year, but over a 5-year period, you might start to see some movement there. So ideally, the things that build organic matter, that build soil health, less tillage. If we can reduce tillage, we're going to destroy less of that organic matter during the season. It's going to help it build, okay? Cover crops, we would like to see cover crops, you know, help build that soil health. Manure, which Rick will talk about, is one of the best things we can do. And then high carbon crop rotations. So if you could get more of a high carbon crop like corn actually in the rotation, that should over time build our soil organic matter. Now maybe corn on corn doesn't work, but maybe you can go corn to corn beans. You know, you get a little bit more corn in that rotation. Beans do not build organic matter just because there's not enough there. You know, there's just not enough plant residue there to really build. So maybe that's where we need to have that cover crop to help out with that. Okay, so then moving on to the other nutrients, so actual nutrients. So if we look at these and kind of prioritize them, the likelihood of a yield response for corn, no surprise that nitrogen is going to has a high potential right there. That's the number one input we put. Phosphorus as well. Some things that are moderate, where we might see a response, we might not. Potassium, sulfur, zinc. Getting lower on the list are chloride and iron. And then the ones that we just rarely see a response here in eastern Nebraska are some of the really micronutrients. So calcium, manganese, boron, copper, molybdenum. So some lower ones there, okay? Anybody know what this one is? What deficiency that is? Phosphorus. So phosphorus, a lot of times we might see that on corn hybrids early if we have cold soils. Doesn't mean there isn't phosphorus in that soil. A lot of times it's a cold soil, the plant can't uptake it. And some hybrids are more likely to show this. So some hybrids get this more of a purple color in them. What about the striping one down here? Any ideas on what's causing that? That one's a sulfur deficiency, which is similar. A lot of times We see this early in the season, cold or wet soils, especially in no-till. It may just not be that available there, okay? Soybeans. Similar, except we don't have nitrogen here, right? So soybeans fix their own nitrogen. We don't need to apply them. Moderate response would be iron and potassium. And low, nitrogen, sulfur, and zinc. And then same ones for rare ones there, okay? So there's definitely some things we should focus on first. If those are not, if those are limiting our yield, we got to get those fixed first. That isn't to say that we might not have there might be a situation where something like chloride is limiting your yield in a situation. Everything else is up above. That's the lowest one, okay? So it may happen. So this was an example where this was actually a low P field. There actually was a growth difference there. And then iron. One thing we're lucky down here, we don't have a lot of iron corrosis. So up by Schuyler, in the bottom right there, the Platte Valley bottom, they don't try to even grow soybeans in that area. We have pHs of 7.5 to 8. We plant beans, they end up looking like this. We get iron chlorosis. pH just makes that iron not available. That really limits our crop rotation in that area. They're stuck with corn in a lot of situations there. Okay, so we're going to talk about nitrogen first. So here's a clicker question for you. I determined my nitrogen rate by A, the UNL Nitrogen Rate Calculator, B, a nitrogen model. So companies like Pioneer has Encirca, there's Climate, there's a couple other ones out there. C, I just use the same rate every year. It's 120 pounds every year. D, whatever my agronomist or co-op tells me. E, some other method. Or F, whatever I can afford to put on this year. Okay, quite a few using UNL's rate. That's good to see. Whatever the agronomist or co-op tells you, and then the same rate every year. We are starting to see more guys use one of these models. What we've studied of them, we've seen fairly good results. They're trying to adapt to what's going on in season. So in some cases, if you have a center pivot, it's a little bit easier to adapt to that, right? We can fertigate, we can add some nitrogen throughout the season. If we're dry land, a lot of times we aren't going to take the time to put on maybe that extra shot of nitrogen that shows that it's low. Computer. So, does anybody think that corn hybrids today are different than they were 25 years ago in relation to nitrogen? See, most of you shaking your head, yeah. So they've actually done studies. They've used old hybrids, compared them to today's hybrids. What they see is that today's hybrids take up more nitrogen later in the season, which is probably why we're seeing better yield with them. So the challenge with that, if they're taking more nitrogen up later in the season, if we're putting all of our nitrogen up front, we start to wonder, do we have enough nitrogen left in the system later in the season, if that's when the hybrids are wanting a little bit more. So after tassel, so by tassel, hybrids usually have about 2/3 of their nitrogen in the system. So they've taken up 2/3 of the total nitrogen they will. After that, today's hybrids take up more from the soil than the old ones did. The old ones just partitioned stuff back from the plant. So they would rob the plant to feed the grain. Today's hybrids are doing less of that. So by doing less of that, gives us better stock quality, should give us better ear retention, things like that, right? Now, if you get a wind event like we had this year, everything can fail, right? So we learned that this year with hybrids. So also, they've seen that modern hybrids use in more efficiently. So per pound of nitrogen, they're going to give you more bushels than the old ones did. So they're getting better efficiency overall. So things have changed, okay? So if hybrids have changed, if you're still using the same fertilizer regime you did 25 years ago, that's when you start to question, okay, maybe I need to change things there. My clicker. So one thing with nitrogen and with all nutrients we talk about is the 4 R's. So the right rate, the right source, the right placement, and the right timing. Those are the 4 things that are critical to make sure we get the right amount. So the right rate, if we knew what the weather was going to be for the year, we could get the right rate perfect, right? But that isn't going to happen. So that's where we hope, you know, in the future we move to more of these models. We move to more maybe of a sensor-based approach where we have a base rate out there. We go through the field with a sensor. It tells us how much nitrogen to put on. Something more responsive instead of just, right now we kind of do a fudge factor, right? We put a little bit extra on to try to get us through those inaccuracy during the year. That works. The challenge with that is nationwide and statewide we're facing nitrates, okay? And part of that is because as we've over-applied a little bit, that nitrate leaks through the system, and we're starting to see that in some groundwater. So ideally, we want to get that rate dialed in a little bit better. The right source. How many in here use anhydrous? Give you 2 reasons, right? It's cheap and timing, right? You can get stuff done in the fall. It's the lowest price. So, you know, that's why we use it. Our big concern there always is we're putting it on in the fall. That corn hybrid still needs some even after tassel. That's a long time it's sitting out there, right? So that's just our part of our challenge with that. How many here use UAN? How many spray their nitrogen on top at planting time or right before? Okay. I do that. We did that this last year on our own field. You know, there's some advantages and disadvantages of that. Number one, UAN is just a little bit more expensive than anhydrous right now per pound, so that's going to cost you. Also, we have the potential for loss. So all of these have different ways to loss, right? We can, with UAN, we're going to volatilize it. So if you're really good friends with a co-op and you can get them to do it the day before it rains, that's perfect, right? But that doesn't always work. So more and more, we're looking at using inhibitors, whether it's anhydrous or UAN.
Rule of thumb was 10 pounds of chicken before
That gets thrown out there. Most of the soil scientists at universities don't really like that because it may not always be that way. You know, it's a kind of a rule of thumb, but yeah, a little bit iffy in some cases too. So something to go off of, but yeah, whether it's always true in every situation is a little bit off, maybe. It does, you know, usually CEC though matches up fairly well with soil texture. So that's where it's going back to. Urea has the same issues. If we dry spread urea, we can also volatilize it. We can lose that to the atmosphere. And then manure is a good source that Rick will talk about as well. Right time. Once again, if we can put things on right before a rain with UAN or urea, that's great, but it just doesn't always happen, right? So each of those have their issues, okay? What we're starting to see, though, is more and more technology that allows us to get things on throughout more of the season. So things like Y drops, things like putting just drops on your high boy, we can apply nitrogen, you know, pretty late then even. You know, it's always a concern. What if it gets wet if I'm going to try to side dress? What if I can't get through there? Well, we have a high boy, we can get through there with pretty tall corn even. So, and then placement, whether you get it in the ground or not, you know, depending on the source, makes a difference on nitrogen losses there too. Distance from the plant, some in industry say, you know, it's got to be right beside the row, right? Well, we're not sure that's as big an issue as they make it seem, but might make some difference in some cases. So quite a few of you said that you do use the UNL Nitrogen Calculator. So that's a spreadsheet. You do have an example of that in your, this exact one in your handouts. So if you go to go.unl.edu /NCalc. You can download this. It's an Excel spreadsheet. With this, you can play with different nitrogen applications. You can play with different nitrogen sources. So one of the keys with this, you can put in your nitrogen price. You also put in your corn price. So this calculator, the last time they revised it, it looks at two main things. It looks at the cost of nitrogen per pound and the price of corn per bushel. So what it's trying to do there is if corn is worth a lot and nitrogen is cheap, the response curve actually moves to where you should put on more nitrogen because you're going to get your money back, you're going to get more yield. On the other hand, if corn is worthless and nitrogen is really expensive, it actually says to go down on that yield response curve. You're going to get less yield, but you're going to make money because those last couple pounds of nitrogen don't get a big response there, okay? The first 10 pounds of nitrogen give us a lot of response, and then as we add more and more, it just gets lower and lower. So it's accounting for that yield and price difference there. So you can plug numbers in. You can do different crop rotations. You can use manure. You can do different application rates. So I just plugged in fall anhydrous at 415 pounds a ton. Hopefully some of you, that was maybe in the ballpark. And then I have urea at the current price. I had 32%, about 260 bucks a ton. Based on that, it gives us, we need 127 pounds of nitrogen based on all of our other credits to raise 200 bushel corn in this situation. You'll notice then it actually then adjusts that up or down based on that price of the nitrogen to the price of the corn. So anhydrous at 415 a ton is only 25 cents a pound of nitrogen. That is cheap nitrogen. UAN at 260 is 41 cents a pound. So that's our price spread there. So with the anhydrous, it actually bumped up in the rate. Part of that also is because of fall application. This actually says to bump up the rate a little bit to account for losses. The UAN, it actually lowered the rate from 127 down to 123. So just something you can play with. You can put in some different numbers, see what it says for a rate. Another clicker question. When am I supposed to be done, Tyler? 10 minutes? Okay. I think so. We'll see. How often do you apply phosphorus fertilizer? Every year, every corn crop, or C when soil tests call for it? A, B, or C with your clicker. I don't know why that one didn't work. Yeah. Well, that's one way to keep moving, right? So, show of hands. Who does it every year? Okay. Every other? Or just when soil tests call for it? Okay. Kind of even there. Part of that is your philosophy. So there's two schools of thought usually on fertilizer. We can do a maintenance program. Actually, there's three. You can do a maintenance program where maybe you just replace, every year some. You can do a build. And then you can also just do a critical level. So UNL's is all based on critical levels. So our critical level for phosphorus, if you're in a corn side of it, we need a critical level of 15. Soybeans is down to 12, and then wheat is 25. So wheat is more critical to have a higher phosphorus soil content. That's using a Bray 1 or Malic 3, which most of us are using in this area. We get in some higher pH fields, they start to use the Olsen, but most of us are either Bray or Malic. So we would say if you have a soil testing below 15, if you're going to plant corn, you should see a yield response to applying phosphorus fertilizer. Now, even if your field's at 20, you still may or may not see a yield response there. It just gets to be a little bit murkier. Sometimes it happens, sometimes it doesn't. Because our actual final point for applying phosphorus is 25 for UNL. So our P rate, they have this formula, is 25 minus the Bray P times 4. So 25 times 25 would be 0, right? So that's why that's where it kicks out. Then we don't apply anymore. So this is a max. We apply a maximum rate of 80 pounds of P2O5. So that's one thing you'll notice with phosphorus, right? We talk about phosphorus, but when we actually talk about applying that nutrient, we talk in P2O5. Same thing with potassium. So you got to do a little bit of math sometimes there, right? So figure that out. Okay, so then after phosphorus, then we get into some of the micronutrients. So on a soil test, you might have these other things listed. So the question here is, do you apply sulfur? I don't know if it's not going to work again. So we will just do this as raise your hands again. Do you apply sulfur every year? Okay. Every other? Or just, excuse me, when soil tests call for it? Okay. Or no? So why are we starting to talk about sulfur when we didn't talk about it 20 years ago? Diesel fuel and gas. We cleaned up the fuel, right? We used to get quite a bit of deposition just from the air. We don't anymore. So sulfur is something we're starting to see some results on. There is some difference of thought here from UNL versus our neighbors to the east in Iowa. The recommendation for sulfur still currently, we would typically only see a sulfur recommendation for sandy soils. That's our UNL recommendation. We don't expect to see a response in other fields. And then based on that soil test, and then also with UNL, we have if you have irrigation or not, because a lot of times we get some sulfate out of our irrigation water. But if we have a test lower than 6, we would start applying 6 to 8, a little bit, and then above 8, nothing. So that's different than Iowa's. Iowa changed their recommendation just in the last couple of years. What they're saying actually is they don't see a really good correlation between soil test, sulfur, and yield responses. So they maybe are actually pushing more to using tissue sampling. That's always an issue with some of these. Sometimes we can do soil sampling, but if that doesn't correlate to final yield, that makes a difference. So there are some different schools of thought with sulfur out there. So look at that. That's one of the nutrients. I'm not going to criticize you if you're applying and UNL say it's not, because I think it's something we need to look at a little bit more in depth with the current situation. Maybe we need to do some new research. Zinc is similar. So zinc, Iowa and Nebraska actually agree on this one. Based on a soil test zinc, using the DTPA extraction, 0 to 0.4, we would apply up to 10 pounds. You get to 0.4 to 0.8. Have a lower application, and then above 8, we phase it out. So this is another one where our recommendations are probably a little bit lower than most labs are doing. A lot of times labs might be at 1. Just depends on different schools of thought out there, okay? So find this sheet here, this blue one, and find the very first field. It's field number 1. I need to grab mine. You got another handout, Tim? Thank you. Okay, so field number 1. As you go across on that, do you see anything that we need to fix in that field? What's the pH? 5.9. So the question there is, what is my crop rotation, right? In this situation, I'm going to say corn and soybean. Do we need to apply? If money's tight this year, I could probably get by, right? But if I want to stay ahead of it, that's maybe a field that I look at maybe putting a ton, just to get ahead of it, okay? So the buffer pH is 6.3. So that'd be 1,000 pounds times 0.7, actually. So it would actually need about 2.5 ton of lime to bring it up to 6.5. Maybe this year, though, I only do part of that just to get start it moving there, okay? Going across, phosphorus is at 20. You want to have a blue sheet? Yep. So my phosphorus is at 20. Corn, going to be corn this year. Is it critical? All depends on my, right? Using UNLs, you might still put on a little bit, because maybe we're trying to get to 25 eventually. But if money's tight, I could probably get by without. Anything else there you see that's critical? Everything else comes out above UNL's recommendation actually there. Next one, field 4, the north third. So that's the fourth one down there. pH at 6.1. Am I good? Probably good for a while here, unless, like I say, if I want to get it back up. Moving across, I get to phosphorus at 24. Not too bad. Potassium, 195. That's still above our critical level. One thing, though, it seems like with potassium, we're starting to see numbers start to keep going down for potassium in eastern Nebraska. So that's maybe a nutrient that we're going to have to look at sometime in the future, starting to apply some potassium. I've seen our soil tests on our farms keep going down on that. So, yeah. So if you've lost 250 parts per million, you're starting to get down there to, yeah. So that might be something in the future we're going to have to start another bill we're going to have to pay. Okay. Mine it eventually, sooner or later, you're going to get to a point you got to put some on. So. UNL's and Iowa's rates on that actually differ. Our UNL is at 140, Iowa is more like 180. So we're starting to get there. The rest of the nutrients there. So sulfate at 5.7, where maybe you're in that area where maybe I could get, depends on my school of thought, right? If I'm looking more at the Iowa, or just some of you experience, that might be where we're starting to see a response. And then zinc at 0.8 is right on that borderline where I probably need to put some zinc on too. Field number 6. pH 6.4. About perfect, right? Phosphorus at 33. We're good. Potassium 340. We're good. Sulfate's 4.5. That's maybe the one that's maybe a little low. Zinc at 149. So that one is one that I know the field history of. That was where they had cattle quite a few years, and it's also bottom field. So that kind of explains why some of those nutrients are higher still. It hasn't been cattle for 40 years, but they were there. And then field number 7, the middle third. There's something that pops out that we need to apply. Phosphorus. So phosphorus came back at 10 parts per million. So that's one that definitely we should see a response if we apply. So kind of start, just go through those progressions, look at those nutrients, see which one to apply first, okay? So the last slide I have here. So what about base saturation ratios? You'll hear, people in the industry, there's different schools of thought on base saturation ratios. So base saturation ratios, if you look at the very right-hand side of your sheet, you'll see base saturation. So we have hydrogen, potassium, calcium, manganese, and sodium. So some people will say we should go off of where we have to have potassium at 4. even if our soil test says we have plenty of potassium. That's based on some, there's some research done back in the 30s that showed that base saturation was the way to go. The school of thought, though, every single study I've basically seen since then from the university has been that base saturation just does not make sense. Go off the critical level, go off of that, if you have the nutrient out there, don't try to just get these perfect ratios between different nutrients. So if you want to try it, you can try it, but you may, some of the application rates to try to bring things up to these base saturation ratios. I've heard them say, you should put on 800 pounds of potash. That sounds great until you look at the bill for that, right? Just to chase this number. So what about biological testing? In your book, so there's a blue one that's a Haney test. So a Haney test is one of the biological testing that's out there. It's something to look at. It's something, gives us some different information that we haven't looked at in the past. So it gives you a rating of biological activity. That might be something that's not bad to get one or two of those on a field. Track that over time just to see. If you're worried about soil health, if you want to build soil health, that's at least some kind of a rating you can go off of. One of the challenges with that, it's not cheap, right? Anybody priced a Haney? About 50, 55 bucks to get one test. So that's why I say do one or two. That a lot of them adds up pretty fast. The other thing with some of these biological testing is we don't have a good idea of the correlation yet. So we can get a field that comes back with a very high biological result, one that comes back with a very low biological test result, but in the end they both yield the same. So sometimes that yield correlation there still hasn't been figured out. There may be useful in some situations. So we'd stress to be a little bit careful using their nitrogen recommendations or their nutrient recommendations off of those compared to what are the other tests that were a little bit more, you would just have that background history on, okay? That doesn't say they're not useful, just we got to figure out the right situations for them. So with that, questions?
Some of the things you've been reading lately, find them you better pick up, put things in, very spray, they have their adjuvant vendor wants to tell you. Going back to ammonium sulfate.
Okay.
We had that
Okay.
That's something corrected my sulfur issue. But I didn't spray that. So you can only sulfur. Hot day or anything else, so that's stress.
Yeah. So the question was using ammonium sulfate, whether you're seeing, as opposed to other adjuvants, whether you're seeing yield response or just some better stress tolerance out of that. If sulfur is one of the nutrients that's limiting in some situations, that little bit of shot of sulfur plus it's got some nitrogen, there may be something going on there. It's also cheap, yeah, especially if you're doing the dry, and that's, yeah, just from that price point, not a bad thing to look at. Now, if you're going to apply just solely to bring sulfur up, some guys have just done ammonium sulfate for that. That's a challenge because ammonium sulfate affects pH pretty fast. So that's what we want to go to a different sulfur source for that kind of situation. But there may be something going on there.
Put the sulfur out of properly. The sulfur out can lower the in some, or each one analyze not response from both at the same time.
Typically, they're analyzed separately. They both can leach, so that's why we typically look at them separately. And they're both released from organic matter with temperature and that. It may look a little bit greener, a little darker, but if you're still nitrogen deficient, it's still going to cause you issues there. So they would be kind of an additive versus just going one or the other. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, I don't know what's, sorry, it's probably our office that did it, right? Maybe it was me.